think there is a sort of sinister aspect to the everyday, you know, or there is, I think that's actually a good observation about my work, that it is a lot about how underneath the layer of the everyday there is this kind of violence, or this sort of these aspects that we don't really feel like thinking about so much. In my opinion, I feel like they're becoming more and more visible. This sort of violence that lies right under the surface is less hidden now than maybe it was not that long ago. But yeah, I think that that's something that I've been interested in as well. And that was some of the work that I made about when I was living in New York, about sort of this sort of symbolics of the US, were a little bit about that, because I felt like they were so based in a certain violence that here in Scandinavia we prefer to suppress even more than they do there. I don't know, I mean, it could come from having grown up in a society that doesn't, or that at least didn't like to talk so much about that. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s in Scandinavia, and it was a time when there was quite a strong push to sort of explaining the world as a place where everybody just wanted what's better for everybody else. I mean, that everything was a big community and there was very little conflict that was really talked about. And I don't think that's a very realistic depiction of the world. And certainly when I moved then to other places, that narrative wasn't as believed as it was. I don't think it's as believed in Scandinavia today as it was in the 70s either. I live in Tokyo now, and I really like it a lot. You know, I lived in New York for 12 years before I moved to Tokyo. And the two cities are in a way a little bit similar in that they're big cities, although Tokyo is a lot bigger than New York. It's a place where when you live there as a non-Japanese person, you're very, very aware that you are not from there. I mean, I could live there for 50 more years, and my son is born there and everything, but in 50 years I would still be sort of, I would still shock people when I came into a restaurant because I'm not Japanese. Well, I can't go to the gym, I can't go to baby swimming with my son, like. Why not? Because in Japan, traditionally tattoos are for the organized crime. Not only, but that's how regular Japanese people see it. So then the rule has become that you can't go to these places with tattoos because that was a way to exclude organized crime. But when they see me, of course they know that that's not me because I'm not Japanese. But in Japan, if the rule is in place, there's no flexibility about it. So the rule's the rule, and then that's it. Yeah, so the work in the main room there is just 3 light poles. 4 lights that are of the same kind as lights that they use on a specific railway line in Tokyo that has a very high rate of suicide. So they've been trying all these experimental attempts at reducing the suicides on that line, and one of the most successful ones has been this kind of blue light that they've installed there. Since it was a small, like, experimental project at the subway, they just used the local kind of mom and pop shop to make these lights. And I contacted the shop and had them make 12 new ones for me. So it's the same light that's in the subway there that's just installed in the gallery. But I quite liked that it was this way of, you know, if you want to tackle suicide, perhaps that's kind of the wrong end to start. I feel like that information is somehow also in this title. And then, of course, when you put it in the gallery, it relates to a certain sort of history of art made using light, like Dan Flavin or something like that. So for me, it also, yeah, sorry about the bad pun, but it sort of reflects a certain light on that kind of work as well, and sort of colors it somehow with this sort of slightly sinister aspect as well. In this case, actually, I read about it. I read an article about, I had actually made an art piece earlier using a similar type of thing where there was another subway station where they installed a mirror because there's a theory that if you saw your whole body, you would be less likely to injure it. And so I had already done this work, and I'd been a little bit interested in this kind of story, and I read a story about these lights, and I went to see them in the station. It also, of course, connects to interesting sort of topics of whether it is, is it the state's job to prevent you from injuring yourself if that's what you want to do, and things like that. So I thought it had a lot of interesting aspects to it. So then I went to see them on the subway line. I saw how they were installed there. I did a little bit more research about them, and then I contacted the company that made the lights. And so we ordered the actual light heads were ordered from the company in Tokyo that made the original lights in the subway. And then we constructed these light poles to match the way that they looked there. So we had photographic imagery and things like that, and then we just tried to recreate this sort of environment that looked a lot like the actual subway station, but that also had this kind of stylized art environment. Because I didn't, the idea is not to recreate 100% a train station in Japan. It was to bring this light up as an idea and to be able to think about what sort of it means to do something like that. So it is also like cleaned up and sort of stylized, and these are clearly 3 kind of sculptures, I mean, it has this sort of aesthetic of the security camera. It has this surveillance aesthetic, which is also an aesthetic that's very familiar. I mean, these particular ones are like Japanese, but I mean, the sort of look of this pole could basically be anywhere in the world. I mean, it has this really public space, like control of public space look, I think. The older I get, the more comfortable I become with authority, I think. But I would say, it is conflictual because all the cultures that I'm kind of drawn to have a sort of anti-authoritarian streak to them. I mean, those are the things I was interested in from when I was young, but at the same time, I don't really have this sort of youthful naivety that leads me to believe that authority should just be torn down. So I think I see it as this kind of ongoing negotiation. And I think it's the way that I've lived in my life. I'm born in Norway, then I moved to New York for 12 years, and now I live in Tokyo. So those are 3 societies where the relationship to authority is quite different. And so it's given me a chance to see that you can negotiate differently with authority, Usually I'll make work for specific projects. Like I'll know I have a show coming up, and I'll perhaps know a little bit what I want it to be about, and then I'll start to collect material that's related to that. And also I have a lot of material that I've collected over like 15 years, I know kind of what I'm interested in, both thematically but also visually. So sometimes I find, old images that I find sort of visually interesting, and I might not know what to do with them then, and then I'll save them, and then, some years later, I'm making a show that's about a certain theme, and I'm like, I'll go back to my archive and pick out this image and do something about that. In a way that it's not like a one-to-one picture. So a lot of these images that I've used that are from old kind of police manuals, for example, have this aspect to them where they're not quite believable. Like they're a little too mannered. The policeman has like too big of a mustache, and the criminal is like too kind of criminal looking. So I think I'm attracted to images that have a sort of falseness to them. So it kind of reveals how the images are not 100% believable. So I think my work is, for me, also a lot about, since I always do use found imagery, it's a lot about imagery rather than the world. It's not this one-to-one like representation of the world, but it's a study of how the world is represented through other means. And how that, of course, relates to authority. And for me also, humor is really important. I always feel like there is a lot of humor in my work, so I think that's what I look for in source imagery too. I mean, like those police or riot photos, I have a lot of them, again, like they're so kind of caricatured, so there is this kind of humor in them like that. Or I've collected photos of like sports cars that are on fire. Some of those are kind of funny as well. Well, I think those kinds of sort of failed, heroic, outcast characters are interesting to me, in part because I feel like some of those impulses are impulses that everyone has from time to time. You know, everyone kind of wants to step outside, I think, wants to step outside their sort of mundane existence. And for certain, I feel like I have those impulses sometimes too. And I think it's interesting to see with people who actually do step outside and follow this sort of usually pretty tragic path. And I think it says something then also about this life that they choose to leave behind. You know, it says something about sort of the choices that are made in order to remain within your like more or less normal life. And I think also for me they're interesting because they represent a kind of parallel to this cliche art role, you know? I mean, the kind of tragic outsider is also very much the role of the artist, the kind of cliche role, especially of the male artist. So their kind of failure is also a way to sort of discuss a certain failure of existing as an artist. Well, this is a use of, I wanted to use a color as the found element. So I said my work is always about appropriated images. And in this case, I wanted the color itself to be the appropriation. It came a little bit out of always being asked why it was always black and white. And I thought maybe it would be interesting to use color really specifically as the color. And then I also thought it would be a little bit funny to then use such an extreme color. I mean, it's also a color that comes from a certain vocabulary of like punk rock and those kinds of things. So it had sort of these two things for me. It came, or three in a way, because it was a color that was really, you know, if you want color, I'm going to really give you color. And then it's this color that has this really kind of punk rock sort of graphic design background. And then it was a color that was similar to the kind of color that you would use in like official graffiti. Like, you know, if you want to cut out a piece of asphalt or something, it's the kind of color that they would use to mark that somehow. So it kind of had all these connotations as color, and then I wanted to use it in a way that was like painting at its really dumbest, which was just covering surface. So basically that's what it is, this found element that is then applied in the most kind of direct and dumb way. Painting at its most basic is just, you know, changing one color to another color, covering a surface with a color. So basically that's kind of what I'm doing in this. I mean, I wouldn't say it's completely a parody, but it has a parodic element to it that sort of maybe doubts the efficacy of expressing emotion through the expressionistic appliance of paint, you know. So it's in a way sort of vaguely a parody of this idea that you can express your emotions through vigorous painting. Well, in a way, that type of painting, maybe it's clear that it is sort of a little bit of a parody, but, you know, at the same time, what's clear in that type of painting is still sort of in art a lot today. It still is this sort of idea of the artist as sort of the expressor, you know. So this idea of sort of the artist being able to express is still there, even in work that is sort of a little more subtle about it than abstract expressionism. Well, I mean, it's not really possible to express yourself like that anymore. I mean, I don't know if it was at that time, I doubt it, but I mean, there isn't a direct connection between your arm and the paint and emotion, I think. painting is kind of dangerously fun to do, so it's quite hard to do it without getting somehow sucked into that logic, you know? So that is a little bit also, of course, what they're about. I mean, they sort of are this criticism of painting, but while you're doing them, it's quite difficult not to get carried away. So that's also why they're a series. They are these sort of different attempts at, again, kind of negotiating that space. The process of making them as paintings necessarily involves a series of aesthetic decisions, and you kind of end up responding to those aesthetic decisions. So you kind of end up getting trapped in this sort of interior logic of painting. It's quite impossible to escape that. Because I think the real thing is really problematic. I don't really believe in the possibility to express yourself so directly through paint. At least not today. But at the same time, you know, when you do paint, you kind of want to express yourself through paint. So that's, again, maybe where the sort of negotiation comes into play, because, you know, the more you paint, the more you get carried away, and the more you start to believe that you can actually express yourself with paint. So, but at the same time, there is this nagging doubt and this kind of realization that that's maybe not that possible today. So I think it's a sort of discomfort in inhabiting certain sort of already pre-existing formats of art, you know.